There's something happening to you right now that you probably can't name. A strange sensation, like wearing clothes that used to fit perfectly but now feel like they belong to someone else. You look in the mirror and recognize the face, but something behind the eyes has shifted. And you can't quite pinpoint when it started. But I want to tell you something that might disturb you. This feeling isn't confusion. It isn't depression. It isn't a phase you're going through that will pass if you just distract yourself long enough. This is what it feels like right before you die. Not physically, of course. I'm not speaking of that kind of death. I'm speaking of something far more profound and far more necessary. The death of who you've been pretending to be. The death of the version of you that got you here but cannot take you where you need to go. And here's what nobody tells you about this kind of death. Most people feel it coming and they run. They run back to the familiar. Back to the old patterns, the old relationships, the old ways of thinking that feel like home, even when home has become a prison. But you're still here. You're still listening. And that tells me something important about you. It tells me you're ready to hear what I'm about to say. Let me describe what's actually happening inside you. Because once you see it clearly, you'll understand why you've been feeling so displaced. You've reached what I call a point of saturation. Your old identity, the one you've been wearing like a second skin for years, maybe decades, has absorbed all it can absorb. It's full. It's heavy. And it's starting to suffocate the part of you that's trying to emerge. Think of it like this. You've been living in a house that served you well. It kept you safe. It gave you shelter. But now you've grown, and the ceilings are too low. The rooms are too small. You're constantly hunching, constantly contracting, constantly making yourself smaller just to fit inside a structure that was never designed for who you're becoming. And here's the uncomfortable truth. You cannot renovate this house. You cannot add an extra room or raise the ceiling a few inches. The foundation itself was built for a different person, a younger person, a more frightened person, a person who needed walls that thick just to survive. But that person's time has passed. And what you're feeling right now, that restlessness, that strange grief, that sense of standing at the edge of something you can't see, this is not a breakdown. This is a threshold. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding this moment. They feel the call and they turn away. They distract themselves with noise, with busyness, with the comfortable numbness of routine, because standing at the threshold means acknowledging something terrifying. The person you've been is no longer sufficient for the life you're meant to live. Now, I need to explain something that might be difficult to accept, because understanding this is the key to everything that follows. You are not your personality. I know how strange that sounds. You've spent your whole life believing that your habits, your reactions, your ways of thinking and feeling, that these things are you, that they define you, that they're permanent fixtures of your character. But this is an illusion. What you think of as yourself is actually a collection of practiced responses. It's a repertoire of reactions you've rehearsed so many times that they feel automatic, inevitable, like breathing. You encounter a certain situation, you respond in a certain way. Someone says something that triggers you, and you react before you even know you're reacting. This is not identity. This is programming. And here's what makes it so insidious. You're not just running this program. You're addicted to it. Your nervous system doesn't care whether your patterns make you happy. It cares whether they're predictable. The brain craves certainty above almost everything else. It will choose a familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven every single time. Because at least in hell, it knows what to expect. This is why people stay in relationships that drain them. This is why they remain in jobs that deaden their spirit. This is why they keep choosing the same pain over and over again, wearing different masks but playing the same scene. Not because they want to suffer, but because suffering is what they know. And you, right now, you're feeling the pull of that familiar gravity. Part of you wants to go back. Part of you is whispering that maybe things weren't so bad. Maybe you were overreacting. Maybe you should just settle back into the old grooves and stop making everything so complicated. I want you to recognize that voice for what it is. It's not wisdom. It's not intuition. It's the old program fighting for its survival. And this brings us to something most people never understand about transformation. You cannot bring the old self with you. I know this sounds harsh. I know there's a part of you hoping that maybe you can change just a little bit, improve around the edges. Keep the familiar parts and just add some new features, like updating an app on your phone. But that's not how this works. Imagine trying to run advanced software on an outdated operating system. The hardware can't support it. The architecture is incompatible. No matter how sophisticated the new program is, it will crash again and again because the foundation wasn't built to hold it. This is exactly what happens when you try to build a new life on old foundations. You meet someone wonderful, but you filter them through the lens of old wounds. You see betrayal where there is none. You expect abandonment, so you create it. You end up dating the same person over and over again, just in different bodies. You get a new opportunity, but you approach it with the same fears, the same self-doubt, the same limiting beliefs. And somehow, mysteriously, you recreate the same limitations you were trying to escape. This is not bad luck. This is not the universe conspiring against you. This is the old self contaminating everything it touches. And here's what I really want you to understand. That exhaustion you feel, that bone-deep tiredness, that sleep doesn't fix. It's not coming from your life. It's not coming from your job or your relationships or your circumstances. It's coming from the weight of carrying a corpse. You're dragging a dead version of yourself into every new experience. And it's heavy. It's so heavy because the dead don't walk. The dead have to be carried. And you've been carrying this weight for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to move freely. But now I need to tell you something that might surprise you. Because as much as I've been speaking about this old self as something to be discarded, I don't want you to hate it. I want you to honor it. You see, that old identity, the one that's dying, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a flaw in your character or a sign of weakness. It was a survival mechanism. It was armor that you forged in the fires of necessity. Think about who you were when that armor was created. Think about what you were facing. Maybe you were a child in a home where love was conditional, so you learned to perform. You became the achiever, the pleaser, the one who made themselves useful because being yourself wasn't enough. Maybe you were in an environment where vulnerability was punished, so you built walls. You became the strong one, the one who never needs anything, the one who can handle everything alone. Maybe you were surrounded by chaos, so you learned to control. You became the perfectionist, the one who manages every detail, because if you don't, everything falls apart. These adaptations kept you alive. They got you through circumstances that might have otherwise broken you. And for that, they deserve your gratitude. I once knew a man, let's call him David, who spent 30 years building an identity around being unshakable. He was the rock for everyone, the one who never complained, the one who absorbed everyone else's problems while pretending he had none of his own. And it worked. For decades, it worked. Until it didn't. One morning, he woke up and couldn't get out of bed, not because he was physically ill, but because somewhere deep inside, something had finally broken. The armor had become so heavy that his body simply refused to carry it anymore. When I spoke with him, he kept saying the same thing. I don't know who I am without being strong. If I'm not the rock, what am I? And this is the grief I want you to understand. David wasn't just facing change. He was facing the death of the only self he knew how to be. The self that had protected him. The self that had earned him love, or what felt like love. The self that had become so fused with his identity that he couldn't imagine existing without it. But here's what David eventually learned, and what I want you to learn too. The armor was never you. It was something you wore, and you can take it off. So before you let this old self go, I want you to thank it. Thank it for protecting you when you didn't know how to protect yourself. Thank it for giving you a way to navigate a world that felt unsafe. Thank it for being the best solution you could find with the resources you had at the time. This isn't weakness. This is wisdom. Because you cannot release what you refuse to honor. You cannot let go of something you're still fighting against. The resistance itself becomes a chain. But when you can look at your old self with compassion, when you can acknowledge its purpose and its service, then you can finally say goodbye. Not with hatred, not with shame, with grace. And now we come to the part that frightens people most. Because once you let go of the old self, you enter a space that has no name, a space between who you were and who you're becoming. And in that space, you will feel lost. I need you to understand that this is not a mistake. This is not a sign that you've done something wrong. This is the void, and the void is where transformation happens. Think of it like this. A caterpillar doesn't gradually become a butterfly. It doesn't grow wings while still crawling. It enters the chrysalis and it dissolves. It becomes nothing, liquid, formless. And from that formlessness, something entirely new is created. You are in the chrysalis now, and everything in you will scream to escape it, to go back to solid ground, to return to the familiar shape, even if that shape was a prison, because at least it was a shape. At least you knew what you were. But I'm asking you to stay. Stay in the discomfort. Stay in the not knowing. Stay in the terrible freedom of having no identity to defend, no image to protect, no role to perform. This is where the magic happens. Not when everything makes sense, not when you have a clear plan, but here, in the darkness, in the uncertainty, in the space where the old has died and the new has not yet been born. Let me tell you what this looks like in practice, because understanding it conceptually isn't enough. You need to know how to actually navigate this space. The first skill is observation without judgment. When you feel the old patterns arising, and they will arise, you don't fight them. You don't suppress them. You simply watch. You become the witness to your own programming. You notice the trigger. You notice the familiar reaction starting to build. And instead of being swept away by it, you pause. You say to yourself, there it is. There's the old program trying to run. There's the fear. There's the defense mechanism. This sounds simple, but it's revolutionary. Because in that moment of noticing, you create a gap, a tiny space between stimulus and response, between trigger and reaction. Most people live their entire lives without that gap. Trigger happens, reaction follows. Automatic, unconscious, inevitable. But you can learn to widen that gap, to stretch that moment of awareness until it becomes a space where choice is possible. Here's a practice you can use. When you feel yourself getting triggered, when you notice the old patterns starting to activate, stop. Don't act. Don't speak. Just breathe. And ask yourself, is this the old me or the new me? That's it. Just that question. You don't need to have an answer. You don't need to know who the new me is yet. The question itself is the intervention, because the old self cannot ask that question. The old self doesn't know it's a program. It thinks it's you. The moment you can observe the pattern and question it, you've already stepped outside of it. Another practice is even simpler. Do something differently. Not something big, something small. Take a different route to work. Order something new at the restaurant. Respond to an irritation with silence instead of your usual reaction. These tiny disruptions might seem insignificant, but they're teaching your nervous system something crucial. Unpredictability is survivable. Newness is not death. Every time you act outside the old pattern, you're proving to your body that you can exist without the old programming. You're building evidence that you won't collapse without the armor. And gradually, the grip loosens. The old patterns lose their power, not because you fought them, but because you stopped feeding them. The void is disorienting. I won't pretend otherwise. There will be days when you feel like you're losing your mind. Days when you'd give anything just to feel solid again, even if that solidity was a prison. But if you can stay with it, if you can resist the urge to grab onto something familiar just to end the discomfort, you'll discover something extraordinary. You'll discover that the void is not empty. It's full of possibility. It's the space where anything can emerge. It's the darkness that precedes every dawn. And then something begins to happen. Slowly at first, so slowly you might not even notice it. The chaos starts to settle. The confusion begins to clear. And what emerges is not a new mask, not another performance, not a better version of the old character. What emerges is who you were before the world told you who to be. This is the great secret that most people never discover. Your authentic self is not something you create. It's something you uncover. It's what remains when all the armor falls away, when all the performances end, when all the masks are finally removed. You don't become someone new, you become someone true. And I want to prepare you for something. When you become this person, when you start living from this undefended place, the world will react. Some people will not recognize you. Some people will be uncomfortable with the change because your transformation is a mirror for their own stagnation. Some people will try to push you back into the old shape, the one they understood, the one that was predictable. They'll say things like, "You've changed," and they won't mean it as a compliment. They'll say, "I miss the old you." What they mean is, "I miss the you that didn't challenge me to look at myself." Let them go. This is perhaps the hardest part, harder even than the void, because you'll be tempted to shrink back down, to reassume the old shape, just to keep the peace, just to maintain the relationships, just to avoid the discomfort of being seen as different. But you will never again be able to shrink yourself to fit spaces you've outgrown. You will never again be able to perform a role that your soul has rejected. You will never again find peace in the old prisons, no matter how familiar they are. And this is not a loss. This is liberation. The liberation of no longer needing to prove yourself. The liberation of no longer seeking permission to exist. The liberation of finally, after all these years, being able to simply be, not performing, not protecting, not proving, just being. Do you understand how radical that is? To simply exist without justification, to take up space without apology, to be who you are without the constant, exhausting effort of managing how others perceive you. This is what awaits you on the other side of the death you're facing. So here you are, at the threshold. The old self is dying. You can feel it. You've felt it for a while now, even if you couldn't name it. That strange grief, that inexplicable restlessness, that sense of standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. This is the moment. This is the invitation. Not to become someone new, but to finally stop being someone false. The death you're facing is not an ending. It's a release. It's the falling away of everything that was never really you. And what remains, what emerges from the ashes of who you pretended to be, is more powerful and more beautiful than anything you could have constructed. Because it's real. It's the only thing that was ever real. So if you feel ready, if you feel the truth of these words resonating somewhere deep in your chest, then I invite you to make a decision. Not tomorrow, not when things calm down, not when you feel more prepared. Now, the old self dies today, not as a wish, not as a hope, as a declaration. You don't need permission from anyone else. You don't need the circumstances to be perfect. You don't need to understand every step of the journey before you take the first one. You only need to decide, and then you need to stay decided, even when the old patterns try to pull you back, even when the void feels unbearable, even when everyone around you is confused by your transformation. Stay decided, because on the other side of this death is a life you cannot yet imagine, a life where you no longer carry the weight of who you used to be, a life where you finally have room to breathe, to expand, to become what you were always meant to become. The old self brought you here. It did its job, and now its time is over. What comes next is not something to fear. It's something to embrace, because it's you, the real you, finally free.